Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's session, Life After Rad, The Need to Plan, Not React, with Nancy Walker and Andrew Curvin. A few remarks before we get started. All attendees are on mute and not on camera. Please enter your questions via the Q&A box in the toolbar, not via the chat. Questions will be taken at the end of the session. The recording will be available on Whova's web app and mobile app, and discussions in this session are not for media use. Please contact Fada directly for more information. It's now my pleasure to introduce former Fada President, Nancy Walker. Nancy, if you'd like to unmute, please go ahead.
Yeah. Good afternoon. I was having trouble getting my unmute button to work. Thank you so very much for being with us. We're delighted to be with you this afternoon to talk about life after RAD, the need to plan. And a good deal of what I'm going to talk with you about today has to do with why you need to plan and some of the information that hopefully will help you to think about those things as you move forward. A little bit about me first. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, a little bit about me. I have 39 years in affordable housing. I've worked in public housing, Section 8 vouchers, Section 8 Pbv, multifamily, Section 8, rural development, finance developments. I've managed 202 elderly. I've been involved in tax credit development and management of tax credits through an affiliate nonprofit. And my experience with RAD is I'm going to share with you initially. Our housing authority, Laurinburg, manages 2 smaller housing authorities by contract, and all 3 housing authorities converted. Maxton is the first one I'm going to talk about a little bit, and that is the first one that we converted. Maxton is a small housing authority. Then Laurinburg has 492 units, which we converted, and we converted those to Pbv. Maxton converted to Pdra because they had no Section 8 program. The same is true for next, our Southern Pines Housing Authority, which has 101 units and was converted in 2016, again, to Pdra because we had no Section 8 program. Next slide. Life after RAD depends strictly on your planning and the choices you make in your conversion. I can't stress this enough, and how important it is to begin to make those plans and understand what that's going to mean to you after conversion. Your funding program after RAD, if you choose Pdra or you choose Pbv, it makes a big difference in the way the program will operate and how you will have to operate the management of your units. If you choose new construction or if you choose rehab, if you're going to replace units, then there's a much more complicated process than if you rehab. The complexity of your financing. What kind of financing are you going to use to reposition your units? Are you going to use internal financing from funds that you have? Are you going to bank finance? Are you going to do a tax credit and bonds? All kinds of questions that you need to answer. Who will own the units? This is probably one of the most important things. It is possible that if you use certain types of conversion, the housing authority will no longer own the units. And that's important for you to understand and know what that will mean going forward. Who will manage? Will the housing authority be able to manage? In some cases, no. Who will get the excess cash flow? And this was paramount for the 3 housing authorities we converted. When you move out of public housing, we have something called excess cash that you didn't have in public housing. It's the money left over that you put into your reserves in public housing. but it's the money left over after you paid your bills and you've paid any financing and you have funded your replacement reserve. Who gets that cash could be very, very important to your agency. The current financial strength and the current operational and financial health of your agency is very important before you go into RAD. Is your housing authority a strong, well-managed, well-financed housing authority? And does it already have some experience with the diverse programs that you're going to be using? Next slide.
And Nancy, if you want to click the start video button, we're not currently seeing your video.
Okay. Well, I'm not seeing my video is not too much of a problem for folks.
Yeah,
Anyway.
that looks wonderful.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. I'm very technically challenged. Next slide, please. The other decision you must make, are you going to do a partial or a complete conversion? For a small PHA, I would say doing a partial conversion, unless you have units that are in really bad condition and you can do some sort of repositioning with them, I would think twice, because when you do a partial conversion, you retain current public housing operating rules on units that don't convert, and then you have a whole new set of operating rules on units that convert. In a full conversion, you eliminate your current operating rules, and then you have a new set of rules to work under. Next slide. Let's talk about the different conversions. The first one we're going to address is the Rad Pbv conversion. You've got a before and after on your slide that you can see. Under Rad, you had operating subsidy. You get Section 8 rents after you convert under Pbv. You go from capital fund to a replacement reserve, which you fund with monthly deposits. Section 3, you go to no Section 3 compliance. Davis-Bacon compliance, you go from from having full Davis-Bacon compliance to no Davis-Bacon. You have the annual plan template, the PHA annual plan template, and under the Pbv, you combine it with your other Section 8 template, and you have your you'll be a Section 8 only if you do a full conversion. Federal procurement, since you are moving from Title IX and out of subsidy to rent paid to the agency for the units, you will not be required to do federal procurement, but you will still have state law, and your owner may establish rules that you need to do. REACT inspections, you'll go to HQS and at some point to the Inspire, which is in development now. FOS goes away and you move to the CMAP evaluation system. Next slide. Under Pdra, and let me explain that Pdra is Section 8 multifamily, and multifamily is a separate division from the public housing division at HUD and operates totally independent of anything in the public housing department. The operating subsidy goes to multi-housing Section 8 rents, and your rent increases are controlled by something called an OCAF. The OCAF is an annual adjustment factor based on inflation. Capital fund, you do again replacement reserves, Section 3 and Davis-Bacon again go away. The annual plan template, you have no annual plan under Pdra. Now that does not mean you don't need to plan or that you don't do a budget for submission, but it does mean that you don't have a template, a form that you have to fill out. You can do your plan in any format that you want. Federal procurement again goes away. You again have state law. And in our case, we decided to keep some of the rules in federal procurement, not because the federal government requires it, but because we are still a public housing authority. And we felt like the need to make sure we were maintaining the public trust was important. So we did maintain some things as a carryover from public housing. REACT inspections will continue. You will get REACT inspections. FOS goes away. And you have something called an MOR, a management and occupancy review. The management and occupancy review is an on-site review. Someone from the multifamily office will visit your site. They will look at your units. They will review your tenant files. your other records, your policies, and score you based on what they find. But there is not a numeric score or any kind of rating system as you have in public housing. Next slide. Other changes after conversion, and I want to stress this, you get regulatory relief, not release. I think that's important. I think some people have thought that all your rules go away. That is not true. Units are no longer part of the Public and Indian Housing Division of HUD under Pdra. And under both PBV and Pdra, rent, not subsidy. You get rent only on occupied units. And this is important to remember. If your unit doesn't have a tenant, there's no rent. Annual rent increase is based on HUD's OCAF. That is both true for the Pdra and PBV. The PBV has some restrictions on that. New financial reporting, you will no longer report under the public housing FDS, and your audits will be handled slightly different through HUD. More local control over funds. This was a key for us, the more local control over funds. Excess cash belongs to the owner. There is less red tape in using the funds you have. We found this incredibly important in 2018 when 52 units were flooded, and we were able to make arrangements with FEMA in a more expedient way than had we been dealing with two sets of rules. Excess cash to the owner is very important. Tax liability may change. If you do tax credits or some other type of financing, you may find that your tax exempt status is affected. And always remember that all of the public housing tenant protections guaranteed under Section 9 carry over to whether you go to Pdra or to PBV. There is a lease addendum for both programs that carry over those protections for the tenant. Next slide. Rad is property management focused. Occupied units and rent collection equal income. If there's no occupied units and the rent collection is not good, then the income is not good. You really have to think about that as you move forward under Rad. It makes customer service a key component of what you do. Next in unit turn and occupancy means that maintenance and the occupancy staff and the management staff have to really coordinate things. Maintenance, doing routine upkeep so that things are caught early so that they don't become major problems, can save you a lot of money and go a long way to your financial stability under Rad. Lease enforcement, the enforcement of the lease is very important so that you can provide customer service to neighbors of the person with the lease enforcement issue. Financial management. Financial management is critical because not only do you need to know what your budget is and are you meeting budget, but why are you meeting budget? Are there other areas of management that you could do that would increase your bottom line? Because that bottom line can go to future work on your units, or you could use it to add units to the community. Next slide. Next slide. Old habits die hard and slowly. I found this to be, I didn't realize this was going to be the issue it was after Rad. When you convert to Rad, you may or may not take individuals that have previously been public housing across to new management positions. But if you do, it's hard to break old habits. And so you've got to really monitor your policy, implement your policy, and really watch daily what's going on, especially the first 6 months or so until people begin to make that transition. So daily operations and finances, do not take your eye off of those until you are well, at least not on, some people monitor monthly. It's important that you monitor that very, very closely and watch it very closely during the first few months after Rad. Next slide. Okay, I think I've moved along a little faster than I did through during practice session, but now we're going to introduce Mr. Andrew Curvin. Andrew is the asset manager at the Cambridge Housing Authority near Boston, where he helps the agency operate 3,000 units in a post-rad and disposition environment. Andrew holds a Bachelor of Science in Construction Management from Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston, Massachusetts. He has worked in development, construction, and management of low-income housing for almost 31 years. Andrew lives outside Quincy, Mass. With his husband, Steve, and 2 dogs. Andrew, your turn.
Thanks, Nancy. I work with the Cambridge Housing Authority up near Boston, and we have 3,000 units. We have sequentially transferred through RAD, Section 8 disposition, and we've also converted some state projects over to a federal Section 8 program. We're about 92% converted on a unit basis. The few left are small public housing properties that don't fit the RAD or DISPO model well, and we're taking a little time to figure out what is the best path to convert those. So our path was basically in starting around 2015 of the actual conversions. Of course, it started much earlier than that. We did several RAD conversions. Almost all of those were with tax credits, with extensive renovation or tear down. And that comprised about 23 properties with 1,253 units. Starting in 2018, we switched over to some Section 18 dispositions, some with tax credits, again, extensive renovation or tear down. And some of them are still in the holding companies waiting for a tax credit award. That covers about 12 properties with 1,243 units. Can you advance to the next slide? And so again, 5 properties, about 222 units are not converted because they don't fit the models well. We're currently switching over to a new software system for the operating properties because software has been challenging. And CHA also is doing consulting to other housing authorities. Can you flip to the next slide, please? So following, just reinforcing what Nancy talked about, and hopefully I won't repeat too much, we found that it was, our software system wasn't charging for all income. So we really are challenged getting to charge for the full subsidy, the full rental portion. The rental portion works, the HAP does not always work as well. Remember that vacancy is now going to cost you real money, and it can add up very, very quickly. You'll want to gross up your vacancy from, and this is more an accounting thing, so that you can understand what your vacancy percentage is, so you understand how well you are operating. So when you're turning over units, depending on how exactly what dates you can rent up at, it can be more financially efficient for you to do overtime and turn those units over faster because you are losing rent every day. Bad debt, be sure to add it up and show it on your income statement. You may want to consider changing some of your policies around collections and the like, because it really can affect your bottom line. And that's sort of business mindset. This is a business, and I often would talk with folks, you know, when I was worked for other nonprofits, you know, we're in the business of staying in business, and it is a business. So can I get the next slide, please? Expenses. So again, I'm reinforcing some of the stuff that Nancy has already talked about. Does your public housing authority get a special real estate tax deal? Will the new ownership get that same deal? So if a public housing unit got a special deal, when you flip to RAD, there may be new ownership, and that new ownership may or may not be able to get the same deal. Insurance. especially if you're in a state that has a tort limitation for government agencies. If you change the ownership, you could come out and slide out from under that tort limitation. You're going to want to talk with your insurance agent about this change and what it means to you. I'm in charge of all insurance, and it is really difficult, and insurance, especially these days, is becoming extremely complex, and we have just hired a consultant to help us with it. A lot of housing authorities have a standard allocation of expenses. You may need to take a look at that and take a step back and how you allocate certain expenses, because once it's privately owned, or if you choose private ownership for the units, that can change how certain expenses are allocated. Reserves, make sure to make the payments and to have a reserve plan. How are we doing on time? We are at 20 past, so we're doing good. So capitalization. So can you advance to the next slide? So some of you are going to see numbers, and this is really an accounting thing. So on the left, you see your borrowing power if you expense everything. So if you buy refrigerators and other things and you choose to just expense them. So both of these properties have $100,000 in rent, and both of them have $50,000 worth of operating cost. The reserve payments, skipping the capital, is the same on both sides, $1,000. But the one on the left has $5,000 worth of items that could be capitalized, but they chose to expense them. That puts the net operating income on the left at $44,000. And if you assume that, you spelled debt right, that 90% was available for debt service, you can support an $880,000 mortgage on the left. However, the person on the right, same property, type of properties, all the numbers the same, but the net operating income here is $49,000, the difference being that $5,000. Again, 90% available for debt service, and the borrowing power increases to $980,000. So when you go to, if let's say you did a RAD and you wanted to wait a couple of years and then do the renovations, depending on how that all worked out, you want to pay attention to your net operating income, because that determines your borrowing power. And one of the things you may want to look at is how you capitalize items. If you just always expense them because you're a housing authority and it didn't matter, you may want to take a much closer eye to that. Next slide, please. Wow, we did really good, Nancy.
Absolutely. No, that was great. And Nancy, I'm going to stop sharing here. And Nancy, if you want to turn your mic and camera back on, we are going to move to some Q&A questions. So for any of the and Nancy, if you could just do the camera button as well, please. For any attendees who have questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A box and not the chat box to enter any questions that you may have. And I'm going to start off with a first question here. And this one I'm going to pose to Nancy. What key factors did your agency weigh when considering conversion to PBV versus PBRA in order to be properly planning for a post-conversion? Example, running your agency is more like a business.
Well, in Maxton and Southern Pines, it was sort of a natural thing because neither of those two small PHAs had a voucher program. And we had experience, both of them were 100 units or under, and we had experience with PBRA. We had managed a 60-unit PBRA, and for a period of time, HUD came to us and we had managed a couple of trouble properties until they could be turned back over to the owner. And then we had also managed a 202 elderly property. And so we were very familiar with the multifamily way of doing things. And so for us, it made sense to convert those units to PBRA. That left the control with our agency, and we already were set up to draw down tracks. We already had sample policies that we could use, so it was just easy. In Laurinburg, we chose to do vouchers because we had a voucher program, and we had already done PBV on our tax credit properties. And so for us, it meant the additional income on the administration fee for the vouchers. And Laurinburg, Maxton, and Southern Pines had all been fairly low allowable expense levels under the old funding system. And we only got a portion of the increase back in the early, around 2000, 2004, when the formula was recalculated. So for us, it was more economic and more common sense based on our circumstances. For someone else, they would have to really look at who they are, where they are, and what they know how to do, and who their partners could be, I think, to decide what to do.
Great, thank you, Nancy. And Debbie actually just asked the question that I wanted to go back to. I think I flipped a little bit too quickly through one of your slides, Nancy.
Yeah, we missed one.
So I'm just going to share real quick. So this was the one I believe that we skipped over, the must be ready to flip overnight. Do you mind reviewing that?
Yeah, this is critical, and this can really be a nightmare if you don't really plan for this, because if you really do flip overnight, you close. You'll close somewhere. For us, we closed on November the 24th, and then December 1, we were now Pdra and Maxton. And so we had to have new leases signed before the end of the month, before the 1st, because if we hadn't had a lease on the 1st, we didn't get any rent. We had to have all the new policies, tenant selection, all of that in place. We had to have our software vendor convert to the track system and take our data across. We had to be ready to draw down tracks, and that took us 3 months before we got any money, because it was we had some trouble with the conversion of the data. We were early in the process. I think the software vendors have really done a lot to fix those problems since then. And then the different regulatory compliance started on that Monday. And so I can't get this machine to stop. Oh, I'm sorry, my phone wouldn't stop. I thought I had turned it off. But you really do have to be ready, and all of that takes an immense amount of planning during the time you're doing conversion to have all this stuff in place.
Great, thank you, Nancy. We have a question from Kristen. Have either of you had experience with structuring ownership from a non-LITEC Rad Pbv project that meets Pbv requirements? Example, Pbv administrator and Pbv owner cannot be the same entity, while also ensuring PHA ownership to preserve all of the tax exemptions that PHAs receive. Example, sales tax and property tax.
Kevin, do you have any experience with that?
So you want to not listen to me, but listen to a lawyer who's familiar with your state policies. But you can set up an LLC, assuming your state has LLCs. But you can set up an ownership entity that is a nonprofit, at least in Massachusetts, that is exempt from the sales tax piece of it. But there are certain things that government entities have, such as a tort limitation that I mentioned, that you want to explore and understand the legal ramifications and also the tax ramifications. But let's say that you had, 123 Main Street, and you set up 123 Main Street LLC as a nonprofit LLC. That would be a different owner than the subsidy administrator being, the Main Street Housing Authority or wherever that be. That's a really high level thing. You really have to get good legal and accounting, advice on how that works, but that's pretty standard. And let me know if I skipped any nuance of that question.
Well, in our case, we moved management of the property to our affiliate nonprofit, and that solved the problem of having the owner and the manager being the same. And indirectly, we control the nonprofit, but not directly, because there are two separate boards with separate board members.
And we have a contract with that ownership entity with the CHA as management agent. So there's a contract for management, and then there's a HAP contract for the HAP.
Okay. Our next question is from Anne. Any advice to help with annual rent increase? Some of our properties are in areas where rents may be lower than what OCAF would allow.
I don't know that you can do anything about that. If you're PBV, you are sort of, the regs are, depending on which version you convert, which version of the notices you convert it under. Typically it's market or 110% if it's PBV. OCAF is just the OCAF, whatever it happens to be if you're PDRA. We did not know that at the time that that was going to be an issue, and it appears that with the fluctuation in fair market rents up and down, up one year, down the next, all over the place, that could become a problem for Laurinburg if, in the future. It hasn't yet, but it could be.
You also, because increases are part of your plan, you always want to ask for at least the amount of increase that you had planned when you went to RAD. And so so you want to, when you can, ask for that. I didn't quite understand about the, if the market rents are lower than OCAF. Of course, I'm in Cambridge, and we wouldn't understand that up here.
Yeah, the restriction is 110% of fair market rent or market, depending on your location. So, but you really do have those restrictions, and you have to make your rent increase each year based on that. But if it's PBRA, you get the OCAF, and that's it.
Next question. Andrew, we'll go to you first, and then Nancy. And I know you came in to your conversion at a different spot, but now that you have converted through RAD, what tools, training, expertise have you found most helpful when issues have come up?
Tools and trainings. So we stayed within the emphasis elite software, but we custom design modules because we were so early on. So just training folks on how to do all the pieces of it. So many of our deals are tax credit, so we had to train our property managers on this is how you do a tax credit research. You round up. Over here on the Section 8 side, you round down, and the like, and the various trainings there were needed in those pieces. And I think that was most of the big lift for us, but that was more tax credit than RAD. With RAD, it was more just, you're moving somebody in, you're moving somebody out, you need to set up the resident rent side and the HAP side, because before in public housing, you just didn't really have to worry about the HAP. It was part of, the Section 9 piece there that came in automatically from accounting. Does that answer it?
Yeah, that's great. Nancy, how about you? Any tools, trainings, expertise that helped you through the process?
The fact that somebody on staff had experience with every program, and most of us in the leadership role had experience with both programs. However, it was some effort to get those new procedures in place and followed consistently. And we really did have to try and do a lot of training, and we had to do a lot of monitoring in the early stages, because like an example was is you got to set up the HAP and you have to put the tenant in the unit. And if that process doesn't go through smoothly, early on we had some software issues because we were the first conversion our software, who is Scott's Accounting, had done. And so we worked with them, but eventually, I think it took us a few months, but eventually they were able to get things squared away. And by the time we converted Southern Pines, the transition of data to the new system of tracks and that sort of thing went very smoothly. I think some of the problems we had early on was we were a guinea pig. It was all new, and in 2014 there'd been very few closings, and so it was not only a learning process for us, but for the software vendor and for HUD for that matter.
Same here.
Thank you both. This is our next question. We'll go Nancy first and then Andrew. Some politicians have said Rad privatizes public housing and oppose it for that reason. They assert needed affordable housing could be jeopardized. Nancy, what are your thoughts?
I think if you really do a good job planning, and if a housing authority is meeting its mission when it sets out to do RAD, the purpose is not to do away with housing. The purpose is to sustain the housing authority and to make sure it's financially viable and that the properties are financially viable going forward. And so I would caution housing authorities not to allow the control of a public asset to be converted and lost from, although it can happen, and there were some horror stories about things that happened early on, but at this point, HUD has a regulation that requires the housing authority to maintain control of the land. In other words, they may land lease the property, but they cannot give up all their right to it. So the housing authority has to maintain some control over the asset in the end. And I think that's critical. Larnberg tried very hard to maintain everything under the control of the housing authority. And I think that every housing authority should want to do that. I don't see why a housing authority would want to do otherwise. I don't think it's happened very much. I think maybe early on when it was new and some people didn't really understand what was going on, it may have happened. But I don't know of anywhere the housing authority in my state or the states that I have contact with that a lot of that has happened. It has stayed with the housing authority, the control.
We have some nonprofit entities that are set up that do the ownership. It's the same board. The board meeting's a little different in that the housing authority has its meeting, it stops, and then 2 minutes later, the nonprofit entity starts. So, well, that's a little odd. And especially when you have a transaction where the housing authority votes on everything, and then we have the next meeting for the nonprofit to then vote and accept everything that we just voted on to, the housing authority votes to give a HAP to this entity, and then the entity accepts the HAP. So it can seem a little weird, but all the control, it really depends on how you set up those entities. And again, you want to listen to legal advice and accounting advice in your local area about how that sets up. And so I know, to my mind, we haven't lost any control over the affordability of the housing. I believe we have gained, control over our housing and better funding streams, and we have improved through this transition.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Nancy, can you talk a little bit more about preparing staff for the transition and some of the challenges that you saw with your staff members?
I thought it would be just my public housing folks who had been public housing managers and public housing occupancy. But for some reason, people whose jobs didn't change. For instance, somebody in Section 8 who had been doing Section 8, they suddenly decided that because other people were changing, they were going to change. And they changed things internally that nobody had said to change. I guess it just was sort of an upheaval and people were confused and unclear. And as much as I tried to train, we sent people to training. We had a fairly large budget the year before we converted on people going to conferences, going to classes, taking certification training. But it just seemed, maybe because we were small and people were accustomed to working together with each other, when one person changed the way they did things, everybody changed. There was some confusion between with tenants and how their rent was calculated, and nothing changed. Their rent didn't change, but they thought it should. And so we had issues with that I did not expect. So you just never know where the problems are going to crop up, no matter how well you plan. But I think had we not sent people to training, had we not spent hours and hours revamping policy and having it all in place, and really truly trying to get ahead of it, we would have had a real mess. We didn't have what I would call a mess, but it was challenging to make sure that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed initially as we were making that conversion. And because all of the property managers, every single property manager had to convert to a new program at all three places. So it was, and people sometimes just don't like change. There is always resistance to change.
Thank you, Nancy. Andrew, how about you? Any challenges in like training staff or helping staff make any transitions that were necessary?
Because I wasn't with the Housing Authority early on those changes, the tax credit jobs, which were a number of the early transitions, the tax credit certifications are much more detailed and looked over by somebody looking and adding every little thing up. That was difficult, but we were able to make the transition there. The biggest thing that we have found is the way we design that customization of the software. We just think there's better software available now, and are making that change for the operating properties, but we're leaving the Housing Authority and the vouchering alone. We're just moving the operating properties over to new software.
Great, thank you, Andrew. We'll start with this next one for Nancy. Given that a few years have passed since you've done your conversions, what wins has your agency experienced, whether cost savings, capital improvements, reduced burdens, etc.?
I think the reduced burdens and the stability of knowing what the funding is going to be has been a big help if you're going to plan year to year and you have some general idea of what your income is going to be, because under public housing, you never know what the appropriations. There were years I closed the fiscal year out and was headed to audit before I found out how much subsidy I was going to get for the year I just closed. And so if I guessed wrong, I could owe the federal government money back. And if I guessed wrong, I'd left money on the table. So that went away, and I think that was helpful. And we were able to truly do a 5-year sort of projection and plan based on what we had expected the OCAF to be. So I think that was a definite win. I think the lady who replaced me when I retired, I would think she would say that the local control over funding and losing Davis-Bacon in Section 3 was a big help. In 2018, Hurricane Floyd hit us, and Laurinburg is not in a floodplain. We're nowhere near. Everybody said, where was your river? We don't have a river. We don't even have a creek. But we had 52 units that were flooded in a flash flood. And of course, FEMA is the vehicle for all of the recovery. And not having to deal with federal procurement on the public housing side, at the same time we were dealing with FEMA regulations, I think she would tell you that it made life much easier for her, and she was much more able to respond in a timely manner because she only had one regulatory agency to answer to. I think too, from the standpoint of being able to get local I don't think that, I don't want anyone to think that I think the premise behind Section 3 and Davis-Bacon are bad. I think the ideas were good. But in our small rural area, the implementation was difficult. We were not able to ever let a contract hardly to one of our local small contractors, many of whom were minority. But since we've gone to RAD and we've been able to modify our processes, we've been able to hire local contractors a lot more. And we've also seen some cost savings because we're not burdening that contractor with all that compliance work. So I think those have been the major wins for Laurinburg and Maxton and Southern Pines.
So for the CHA, we're a moving to work agency. So we were able to alter our admin plans and other regulations to layer on a moving to work layer into the vouchers and then combine that with tax credits to really help with those conversions, to do the added deep greening that we wanted to do. And a lot of that is not applicable to many of the folks here, but that was a huge win for the Housing Authority, was to take our moving to work status, combine it with RAD disposition, and really create a financial vehicle with the tax credits to do a tremendous amount of very deep and needed renovation, and occasionally to tear down and to rebuild in that piece. But also just the freedom from a diminishing resource of the Section 8, the public housing side of Section 8. I think it's Section 9, but hopefully that.
And I would add, we picked up admin fee on 492 units in our Section 8 program, which was helpful, especially at a time when Section 8 admin fee is being very much underfunded.
Andrew, Kristen asked what software you're switching to.
So we were on Emphasis Elite for the whole agency. We went to RAD. We had some modules custom built very early on for us. And what we're finding is that the regular modules in Elite work well for the vouchering and the Housing Authority. But the custom modules that we built for RAD and Dispo, or Section 8 disposition, we're going to switch over to Yardi to operate the standalone LLCs that actually own the properties and put that together. So it's been an extremely long, it's been a couple of years now of real soul searching within the agency about what works, what doesn't work, what's available out there, because it's a huge lift to move to a different software platform. So it was a long process, and we're doing a lot of planning around that, and so I'm leading that effort.
Thank you, Andrew.
Hopefully that answers your question.
Great. Next question, we'll start first with Nancy. Do you have any regrets, or would you have done anything differently knowing what you know now?
Well, hindsight's always 20/20 and foresight's blind. But I don't know that there is a lot we would have done differently. I think in the long run, it was a good choice for our agency. Being a small community and being well received in the community and having, I'm trying to think, what would I have done differently? I think maybe I might have planned a little differently and worked a little differently at implementing some of the changes that we made related to staffing. But in the end, it worked out okay. It took longer than I wanted it to, but what doesn't? I think all in all, what we did worked best for us. I don't know that I would go back and change. I don't know that I would change any of it. Because we converted early, we were able to do some things that I don't think you can do now because they've rewritten the regs 4 times since we converted. And I think we're on version 4 of the Rad notice now. And we closed 2 properties under the first notice and 1 property under the second notice. So I think I'm glad we really got in on the early end of it when it was still being built.
I don't know that we really have any regrets if doing anything differently. I don't think we would have done it differently. We have since learned, a lot about the different rules with software and what is, how to administer that. But I wasn't there for that. I was more here on for the past couple of years where, okay, this doesn't work. How do we get this to work? And, leading that effort. So I'm sorry, I don't have the real background.
No, that's helpful. Thank you, Andrew. And Andrew, you mentioned when you talked about, this being a business and, if units aren't occupied, you're not getting that rent. Are there any other kind of like key shifts that you saw in your agency from, really embracing that business mindset?
One of the things that I do weekly is a vacancy report, and we meet regularly and talk about the turnover process and that piece there, and how that fits into it so that there is this mindset of get that unit turned over. It's really hard when you have, reasonable accommodations coming in and making the appropriate time accommodations to meet the needs of the reasonable accommodations, which then cause usually another unit turnover, and making sure that folks understand about keeping their list up to date, and having ready files for folks to move in. Has been an effort there. Getting the rent increases in, getting them calculated, approved through the system, is important because you're now running a business that, and you need to plan your capital needs out so that you understand at the end that you're going to have enough money to replace that roof when it needs to be replaced, or what sources you're going to be able to go to. And so you may need to look much more at your properties as an individual business, and how they fit into your business plan, and sort of have that plan, which is kind of what this whole hour is about, is having a plan, having that capital needs plan, understood, agreed upon, and you're putting away enough money there. Or if you cannot meet the needs, where are you going to get that funding source? So taking a look at your net operating income and making sure that you are meeting it so that you do qualify for that loan. Or if you are going to need to go to a local source, about where you're going to go to get perhaps a soft loan or some other piece there. But, when before this, I worked, a couple of jobs ago at a local standalone, nonprofit development organization. And, it was part of NeighborWorks America. And we always talked about, we're in the business to stay in business, and you need to watch where it is. And if you have excess net cash, you may need to put that into your reserves and have that plan.
Thank you, Andrew. Our next question is from Russell. How were you affected with having rent caps on the first conversion and caps being eliminated under REV2 conversion? We can ask Russell for some clarification if that's.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly.
Other than more is more, and you can do more with more. You know, I'm not sure what versions our different RADs were under, because we're a moving to work, and so we, you know, sought release through that process that not everybody has.
And Russell, if you want to add any additional background to that, please feel free to add that in the Q&A. Our next question is from Mitzi. Why would you wait 2 years to start renovations after the conversion?
I assume that's directed at me because I talked a little bit about that. We do have a couple of like large developments. The land that was used for them was in a low-lying area, and they have mold issues. The whole place needs to be torn down, built up. We need to qualify for tax credits. So in the disposition piece, we put into a holding company waiting to get an award for tax credits. So the waiting is not on us, it's the waiting on funding, the additional funding. And that piece there. But you may have a property that you know is okay right now for the next couple of years, but you know down the line you are going to need to do some serious work with that. We do have one small RAD. Right now we're just so busy doing the large projects that project, it's, you know, on the calendar for 2025 to do that. And so we have, you know, a needs plan, and we are doing what we need to keep things moving along there for the next 5 years. And then in 2025, we're going to do a heavy duty renovation depending on what the funding is available. You know, other sources of funding are available. So some of it could be just the staff capacity, you know, volume of work kind of thing might be why you waited. But in general, we didn't want to wait. And our phasing is mostly just on funding and waiting on tax credits to combine to do the renovations, because our portfolio was, you know, like most public housing had, you know, the buildings were solid, but needed a tremendous amount of rehab, plumbing, electrical, needed to be pulled out and redone.
One more question also from Mitzi. How has the conversion affected the COCC?
Good question. So each property is operating on its own and will often reimburse the COCC for certain costs that were done. Sometimes if it's an individual property expense, you'll expense it straight off the individual property. There are things like payroll that come in to the COCC and then get billed out. So there's a bill out process that you need to think about, because the property is actually owned by a separate entity. And so you may have to do an invoice to the property for that payroll and bring that back in. But the effect to the COCC, you know, is that in general, you're charging management fees to the standalone property for managing it, and that's covering a lot of your internal costs, and you need to do a business plan for that as well.
For us, we don't have a COCC because we don't have any public housing. It's now all under other business activities, which makes it a little more simple.
Great, thank you both. And I wanted to mention that Andrew and Nancy were very generous to offer up their email addresses if you wanted to get in contact with them. This will also be in the PowerPoint that we upload on Whova along with the recording. I just really wanted to thank Andrew and Nancy for their time and sharing all of their experience and expertise. The recording of this session will be available on Whova later today. As we take our break, please stretch, grab some coffee, network with affiliate attendees, visit our exhibit hall on Whova, Please also take the session surveys that can be found in Whovo. We really want your feedback on sessions and what we can offer in the future. Our next sessions will begin in a half hour at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again to both of our presenters.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.